very warm welcome to everybody. And I understand that it's a bad timing for our first celebration. It's difficult to distract me. But I'm really asking you to try to do it at least for some 45 minutes, because that's the first celebration, and we are trying to celebrate French language and culture. And I will be very vocal about what we are going to do today. So, first of all, we will invite the youngest members of our community, so the singers from the LSMU primary school, and they will perform beautiful things for you. And, well, I will tell what they are going to sing. It will be the group Mother and Love Hurts. Well, and then it will be English educated, so I draw Lithuanian, and we say thank you for the teacher Kristina Petrowskina. Then the soloist of Kaunas Boys and Youth Choir singing school, Markelis Matas Levinas, will sing Richard Rogers and a voice. Thank you for his teacher Thomas Ladiga. After that, Emmanuel Levinas' grandson, David Hansel, will present our lecturer, Flora Bastiani. After that, we'll have the lecture. After the lecture, we invite everybody who wants to discuss the possible collaboration between LSMU and CREL with our guests to the Emmanuel Levinas room. That's it. So thank you for coming, and thank you for being with us.
Nupiešiu saulę lapo vidury, aplinkui košė visom spalvom dažyta, o apačioj tarp žemės ir dangaus nupiešiu savo Lietuvą mažytę, žaliai tapysiu pievas ir miškus, rugiagėles, melsvas laukus geltonus, o jei pavyks, nupiešiu būtinai širdelių raudonų 3 milijonus. Juk nėr gražesnės Lietuvos nei ši, vaikų širdim ir rankomis tapyta, nors esam dar labai maži. Be galo mylim savo šalį šitą. Nupiešiu jūrą bėgančią krantu ir smėlio pilį gintarais dabintą, o jei pavyks, nupiešiu būtinai, kai po ilgos nakties diena nušvinta. Juk nėr gražesnės Lietuvos nei ši, vaikų širdim ir rankomis tapyta, nors esam dar labai maži. Be galo mylim savo šalį šitą. Ir niech pasiut Lithuanie bent Briuselis į Anabę, legion elementą. I love you, nusaman corpeli. Nuzemo profundemos eba ignoti. Nors esam dar labai maži. Be galo mylim savo šalį šitą. Džiaugsis diena išvyta.
Yes. They will.
No, they already yes.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay, so I was asked to say a few words in introduction of President Flora. I'd like first of all to say thank you again for this wonderful initiative that was taken here to open this this center. I will not say again what was said at the opening, but in December 6th here, I think today is March 1st, so this is the beginning of the month of Francophonie. So it's another event which is important. So Flora, I know Flora since 2009. It was a time where we were preparing, you were organizing in Toulouse, at the University of Toulouse. You just after the graduation from Emmanuel Levinas, and you were preparing a huge conference on the book of Emmanuel Levinas, Difficult Freedom, Difficile Liberté. So this was a very big conference that you organized in Toulouse. The logistics was very, very complicated. It was in 5 different places in the city. It's kind of Toulouse 2010, kind of that. So it was over 1 week, and so it was absolutely fantastic what you did. And then you got your position at Toulouse, at Université Jean Jaurès, a few years later.
10 years.
10 years later. But since 2010, you are a member of the CRS, the Centre National de Recherche Emmanuel Levinas. And every year you organize this workshop, which is in July, the first week of July, Flora is organizing a workshop on Emmanuel Levinas. Since then, during 2 years, it was not possible to have it because of the pandemic, but this year, 2022, so we are resuming with this workshop, and actually it will be here in July, and it will be dedicated to the first Levinas, Levinas before Levinas, so Levinas before the war. So your specialty, your PhD was in phenomenology, and your specialty now is, among other things, about Levinas and the implication for in healthcare, and so that's why it's very important. This place was really, par excellence, the right place to have this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid it will be less entertaining than the songs, but so I would like to sincerely thank Ingrida Krosowskine and Julia Walitsenko-Maskifte, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, and the Emmanuel Levinas Center for the invitation and for the opportunity to present my work for you today. This presentation is based on the analysis of an interview with G state-qualified nurse for 14 years, including 10 years in an intensive care unit. In particular, in the resuscitation care. The analysis aims at understanding what is daily practice mean, especially on the phenomenon of community in the relation of care. I will therefore rely on the practice described by this nurse to try to understand what guides him in the relation of care by inspiring myself on analysis of Emmanuel Levinas and of what he calls intermediary sphere, in French, sphère intermédiaire, while considering the relation of one and the other human. Levinas asks himself how two different worlds could meet. What could be the modality of any encounter with another human? And this question is significant in the care of a person in an induced coma, like in resuscitation care. Because all the usual benchmarks of a relationship are lost, like the language and the facial expressions. The intermediary sphere of Levinas means a kind of space where difference can meet. He comments it with an image. So it's from the book Difficult Freedom that David was talking about, and in an article called A Religion of Adults. God never came down upon Sinai, Moses never ascended to heaven, but God folded back the sky like a blanket, covered Sinai with it, and thus found himself on earth without having ever left heaven. The blanket covers the Sinai without becoming a part of it. This is the intermediary sphere. It is a very special way of being together with the other without trying to erase it by my representations, by my willing or my intelligence that try to catch by understanding. The encounter of the other is based on a gesture that maintains the differences while allowing to be together. So let's see how the practice of G can bring something to this discussion. So I quote G. Not everyone dies in resuscitation care, and so we assume that everyone who enters our unit will be cured. So we are all going to set things up so that if the patient ever gets better, he would have had these tools, these things, to be able to get better afterwards. In this discourse, descriptions of the actuality of resuscitation are continually inhabited by the patient's future. Whether they lead to death or to waking up, it is to this end behind resuscitation care that his attention turns. The indeterminacy of the patient's future, when he says, not everyone dies, give rise to an optimistic consequence. So we assume that that justifies actions toward that consequence. So we are all going to set things up. This primacy of the optimistic logic seems to engage the wall of G's care practice, which we will describe in the following. Both because it expresses an optimistic aim, but above all because this aim is expressed through consequences from indeterminate. Even pessimistic premises, since we could transform the first proposition, not everyone dies. Some people do not die. Death seems indeed to be admitted as an important, even predominant possibility. We find here both indeterminacy of the future of patients hospitalized in the intensive care unit and the relation maintained by G with this indeterminacy of the future of the patients, which constrains all his practice in the direction of an eventual cure. Usually, if ever, you see it. Usually, if ever, poses a condition by underlining its probable consequence, always describing a future context. In this sense, the statement could have been so that if the patient ever gets better, he will have these tools. However, in G's use, this locution has a different meaning. It is associated with a consequence expressed in the past tense, that he would have had those tools. This consequence, associated with the locution if ever, mixes the strata of time in such a way that the future, the consequence of if ever, becomes the past of the condition, but is at the same time referred to an afterwards, because it says to be able to get better afterwards. The past tense describes the consequence afterwards, the resuscitation, while the if ever introduces the condition of getting better in the future. The mixture of tense is significant of a tension between actuality of care and the future. But above all, it makes evident an important element in G's practice. The actuality of care finds its value in the future. In other words, the patient's future is involved in everyday act of care, in an approach that takes time upside down. The linear order of time, present premises, future consequences, is reversed, future premises, present consequences, so that the actuality of the care is conditioned by a future that nevertheless remains undetermined. The usually linear order allows us to think of the irreversibility of an act associated with its future consequences. If the order is reversed, as in the case of G's speech, then the irreversibility of, or the power of determination is attributed to the future. In this case, the determining motive to come is indeterminate. G is thus situated in view of the determination of his conduct with the patient's future in an in-between trajectory, death or life of the patient, which constantly come together in a quasi-contemporaneity, in that they infuse the present of the care with a set of determinations. The quote is a bit longer, but I'm reading it. One of the examples of changes in practice that we have implemented in the unit, in the prevention of sources of discomfort, we no longer have alarms. So that means that all the alarms are outside the patient's room to avoid the impact of noise on the patient, and we know that noise has an impact on delirium and on stress and oxygen consumption, and all that. So we have to, well, you have to imagine a patient full of machines, the door is closed, and we go from an auditory monitoring system. So we used to say, it's ringing over there, to a visual monitoring, and therefore a return to the clinical monitoring of the patient, which we had forgotten. Sorry. These arrangements concerning sounds represent a part of the work on the minimization of the disturbances, which can be approached as a reconstitution of the conditions considered as usual of existence, imitating a natural environment by reducing the interventions of the hospital environment on the daily life of the patient. It should be pointed out here that the risk of aggravating delirium and post-traumatic stress is the condition of the measures taken concerning the sources of discomfort. In the present of care, the actions taking place in the present are conceived with the project of a possible improvement of the patient's future, in a future present articulation that makes the present a commitment to the possible. In this sense, it is not only a matter of preventing present discomfort, but of acting in anticipation of the possibility of future discomfort. Future existence, even if uncertain, constrains G's vision of care. G's narrative shows a way of avoiding the impact of the specific condition of hospitalization and the technical nature of resuscitation care. This is also the case for the management of lightning. It says, at night in our unit care unit, we may have machines with 3 liters of blood next to them, no light. At night we are in the dark to sleep. To respect the nictemeral cycle of the patients, precisely to avoid that they shift, to avoid the day-night reversal, and then the impact again, delirium, post-traumatic stress. While recounting the visible side of the functioning of his service, G reveals the deep preoccupation that drives him to work behind the scenes. The gestures for the minimization of the interruption of the usual world of the patient are based on a preoccupation for the aftermath, which occupies all the sickness of his reflections and his choices. The importance of machines and substances is replaced by a position of anticipation of the patient's future, which is understood as conditioning the actuality of care. The one, technically, is related to the other, anticipation of the future, through the experience of mastering one's primary mission. The relationship between these two aspects has thus developed over time as an evolution in G's own situation, progressing from the acquisition of mastery of technical knowledge to the development of care integrating the complex temporal dimension in such a way that, even if he does not formulate it, time becomes for him the space, the place where care is exercised. It is the same impulse to predict the patient's future that is found in the administration of drug treatment. He says, change 1 milligram of medication, you're not going to see the difference right now. But he, at 90 days, 3 months, 6 months, a year, will see the difference of what you did there. Because afterwards, you have to think about his family life, his professional life, his sexual life, his social life. And after the resuscitation, what does he have? This precaution in the use of substances, as well as the preoccupation that G evokes, are not explained by external recommendations, but only by the aim of the patient's future. It seems that the emergence of horizon is not only limited to the care itself, nor to the long period of post-resuscitation rehabilitation, but is articulated from the prediction of the patient's future quality of life in a longer period, outside of what is directly related to care. When G underlines behind, you have to think about his family life, his professional life, his sexual life, his social life, it seems that he is not referring to the past, what the patient had before hospitalization, but rather to the different layers that constitute his existence. The prescriptive formulation "you have to" appears as a reminder of the patient as a person. One must not forget that he has a life in all possible dimensions. This attachment to the thickness of the patient's personal existence, which is put on hold by resuscitation, could be understood as the articulation between the present of resuscitation and the future of the patient's life. Will his potential existence survive to resuscitation? By linking medication and future quality of life, this discourse implies a form of responsibility toward the occurrence of the expression of this potential, of this life. The withdrawal of the patient in coma does not allow him to express this life. But for all that, it must not be forgotten. It is this future absolutely proper to the patient, to the condition of his survival, but also of his life, that G thinks when he treats him. One could find in these descriptions of dimension of Emmanuel Levinas' analysis concerning the relation to the temporality of others, always shifted, external, from which the subject will never be able to approach or extract himself. For Levinas, diachrony appears as the relation of temporal difference with the otherness in others. The heterogeneity of others already extracts them from my present. My present, that of the lived experience of my existence, refers to me and to my presence in my environment, whereas the other as other is situated behind any possibility of grasping, always exotic, always future. In the analysis of G's speech, we find precisely the patient as an opening towards a distant and inaccessible future, but which must be considered in order for the care to be in some way to him. Indeed, when the relationship with the patient is established, it means for G the opening of this temporal framework in which he is inscribed without appropriating it. it is important to underline that the temporality lived of reference is the one that belongs or will belong to the patient. And the state of unconsciousness of the patient allows to consider that the present of the patient, the present of the acts of resuscitation, does not constitute a real present, because it is not the present of the patient, but a kind of state of exception, where the existence of the patient is like in suspension. It may also be enlightening to associate such an inscription in the patient's temporality with the breaking of the other into the world of the self, evoked by Levinas. It is the patient who determines time, and in the absence of the patient due to the coma, the present is delayed to the future. In these words of G, the description first concerns the point of view of the caregiver when he says, "You're not going to see the difference." But it is immediately reversed by the "but he." The point of view and the evaluation of the patient is more important than the attachment to the present of the caregiver. Not only does the relation to time seem to be reversed, the future understood as present judges the past, which is the present of the resuscitation, but it is the unconscious patient who will be the judge of the present care. The present can only have value in terms of the future of the patient's quality of life. According to G's proposals, the act of care is indeed conceived as a duty towards the future of the patient's life. The patient's consciousness as a return to life seems to constitute the point of articulation of all this description, the temporal tangle and the qualitative apprehension. It seems that it is the experience of basic missions, what he calls basic missions, that is to say, in a way, the mastery of tasks that G considers to be primary to technical care, that allowed him to discover and invest what he calls, during the interview, another dimension. The introduction of the notion of otherness within care appears as a deepening of the missions in which G's investment intensifies and comes to a form of appropriation of the relationship between actuality and future. The time on which the care is inscribed belongs to the other and allows us to understand the entry of the other into care as a transformation of time that is extracted from neutral temporal reference, including in the basic missions, hygiene, application of the medicines, monitoring of the various machines of substitutions. The turning point in the experience of time is situated on this change from a technical temporality to a clinical temporality. That is to say, of contact and observation. It is situated in the shift from the perspective of a direct care for the patient to care for the future of the patient. Instead of relying on the synchrony of care and its benefits, there is a dissociation that opens the temporality of the relationship to the other as a relationship with the future of the other. The relatives are part of this new perspective as participants in the future and in this heterogeneity internal to G's care practice. G explains that he offers to the relatives the opportunity to make the room their own in order to make it a familiar place for the patient. About the room, he says, it is a universe that they will make their own for a certain period of time and thus give them reference points and things. The family photos or the perfume are as many elements quoted by G and solicited to build a space. From the impersonal space, neutral and functional of the hospital room, toward an appropriate space, which produces a wall of visual, olfactive, auditive, personal references. The familiar and personal dimension seems to intrude against the neutrality of the hospital room, even in spite of it. Through the appropriation, it is, strictly speaking, a question of producing a singular word, a word to the measure of the patient, created for him, but through a mode of production that is displaced, resulting from, not from the patient himself, but from his relatives. Indeed, the particularity here is that the patient, being unconscious, is not able to work for the formation of his own world, of his own place. It is thus from the relations that his relatives maintain with him that the reference marks will emerge and accumulate to form his very own room. The whole point of this process is that the world could be recognized as an area marked by familiarity, as an area that could be produced by the patient himself. Listening to G, one can understand that the therapeutic bet of this ephemeral place is that it provides, in the best of case, a form of holding on the patient, that is to say, the creation of a supportive, even containing framework for the anxiety that the patient may feel at the moment of waking up. The implementation of elements that forms an appropriable world is more likely to win the patient's commitment, allowing the place to become an intermediary between this, what is internal and what is external for the patient, and facilitating the patient's perception of the place as safe. The quality of intermediary of the place, of this place, is precisely a question of walking on the limit between inside and outside, between familiar and foreign, and containing and frightening. The proposal of a pre-made world for the patient consists in a kind of prevention of the loneliness of being without a world, against the feeling of strangeness invading the whole perspective, and which can lead to a form of depersonalization or of impotence to invest the environment. Among the techniques used to create a dynamic of familiarization, which will become meaningful when the patient wakes up, G mentioned an important tool, the logbook. A logbook so that the family and the caregiver can report on the stage of life of patients who are in a coma, who do not know what is happening, what they have a loss of temporal and spatial references. And so, thanks to this logbook, we write things down in a common, simple way so that when the patient comes out, he can read, oh, there was a game of the soccer team that I like a lot and they lost or they won. for example. This logbook, which makes it possible to record a narrative of daily life, is added to the strategies of sensory constructions of space by allowing the dimension of an appropriation of a place to be added to that of a story or even of time. Thus, the patient will have this place, his own place, conceived by others for him, and he will have his story, told by others for him. All this so that he can appropriate these two dimensions when he wakes up. We can compare these different processes to the welcoming of the newborn, which is generally structured by the place, the preparation of the room in which the parents project their future, and the birth diary, which gathers memories and operates a personal narrative articulated on the family environment and the expectation of the birth. We could therefore extend that these processes reproduce the expectation of the birth, or at least the planning of the place within a family or a community. The inscription in an appropriable history and the proper corporative integrated in the place appear as the two necessary dimensions to found a form of personal autonomy in the world. The appropriation of a narrative does not tend to gather information, but allows one to try to access a kind of continuity of the course of existence, where succession of periods are internally seen as a description of what our life is. The different temporal strata mixed one into the other are directly put in view by the care of G that G describes. Different futures are imagined, all of which start from this quest for the literal construction of a time that cannot be lived. In other words, in the very place where time cannot pass. Since time is not lived in the first person, it is made in the manner of the first person, that is, in an appropriable narrative, which could be adopted as a pseudo-memory. But creating a place and creating a narrative for the patient doesn't describe yet what really structures the care practice of G. Over these strategies for supplying the patient during his coma, in anticipation of his future life, G is concerned by what is a human life? What is human in life? What makes us human even in a coma or even in a disease? G puts himself as a kind of mediator between the impersonal of technical devices, for example, the machines, and the personal, between the neutral and the singular. He opens up spaces to introduce the personal by authorizing the relatives to participate in an act of care. Care can appear as something that separates when it is an intrusion or even a break of the intimate sphere by the neutrality of the tools. But it turns into proximity as soon as the personal is recomposed by finding a way back in. True care, according to G, appears in a perspective of going beyond care, as if it were only a lever to allow the intimate dimension of what existence to break through the veil of neutrality of the care unit. However, it appears that it is not the simple search for a situation that matters, a situation in the place and in a story or in a narrative, but through it, the search for the reconstruction of the natural relationship, whether it is a question of daily accompaniment, the moment of awakening or the moment of the end of life. The search for dignity in care is revealed through the desire to bring the patient closer to his own intimacy, to a horizon that preserves the trace of his humanity. The natural is no longer natural in the context of intensive care. And this care practice appears precisely as a practice of repairing or mending the natural connection. The resuscitation techniques carries a profound brutality because it makes evident the unthinkable of the serious illness, not only of death, but the loss of oneself. G can only try to re-establish the personal link or this proximity, while the possibility of his death remains in the background of all attempts to rehumanize the care. I have reported different aspects of care: the relationship to the patient's future, the creation of a custom-made relationship environment. All of these efforts are aimed at offering a world to the patient, a world that is not a situation in a spatio-temporal space, but an intimate world animated by relationships. G sets up a relational substitution in a close relationship with the patient's singularity. It is the very particular helping relationship that we could call sphere intermédiaire or intermediary sphere in Levinas' words. Two layers are superimposed in the hospital bed: the hyper situation of technical care, which literally attaches the patient to the machines, but which is in a situation of expropriation determined by the intrusion of the outside. And the care described by G as a kind of situation tense in the relationship with the caregiver and with the relatives. The patient is not absent from the care, in spite of his unconsciousness, because G carries out the care only on his behalf. For all that, everything happens as if it were necessary to take care of the patient's future while he is on standby, as if caring consisted in making this future exist, in urging it to happen by holding open the patient's singularity in the world. He is not absent, the patient is not absent, but he is powerless to be present. And so it is G's responsibility to keep him present, just as one keeps a seat in the cinema for someone who is about to arrive. Thank you for your attention. I don't know. I thought there will be someone to translate.
Yes,
You can translate.
I'm still overwhelmed
Sorry?
by the profoundness of the lecture or presentation. I understood you took it as a daily life of the ICU.
Yes.
Or daily life in a basic care unit. And you took just one example,
One nurse.
one case.
Yes.
One nurse, one case.
Yes.
One attitude. And it's interesting because we are, the way we are working in the hospitals, we are professionals.
Yes.
We
Good.
do deal
Yeah.
with such a situations daily. And sometimes, and in a majority of cases, we run our activities, daily activities, according to special algorithms. And where individual cases do not fit in this frame. So in some cases, yes, of course, they would match the situation you are describing. That's what makes medicine, in a way, dehumanized, or should I call it?
That's it.
And in some cases, the ICUs, they are so sophisticated that you take care of all those minor details, minor things, like architecture, the design of the department of ICU, windows versus no windows, windows towards the forest, then you turn the bed towards the window, and if you are conscious for a millisecond, you see the landscape, you see the forest, things like that. And on the other hand, we speak about hospital altogether as a concept, that it shouldn't be so kind and nice to be in the hospital, that you should spend exactly necessary time what is needed to be healthy. And then even with the minor details, you can manage yourself at home with your relatives, your friends. You leave the hospital before it becomes unpleasant place. That's that's another interesting.
Thank you.
And you brought many interesting things here. It's how you can, and it's not only juggling with the meanings and with the words. It's better to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad it talks to someone who works on this thing.
Well, we have a faculty of nursing.
Yes.
Nursing is one of the most important things right now in our education system and also in the healthcare system. And the nurses, they become sophisticated of caregivers. And they are dealing more not with the physical things like you taught us about dosage of the substances of the medication. Yes, it's correct that the survival and certain things what we consider, or we will call it quality of life, do depend on the prognosis and in an intermediate, in a far follow-up period. But there are things, psychological things, and we speak about those who survive, and there are those who are leaving. Also, this is also an important topic for us, how you should follow those patients who will be leaving, who will not survive.
At the end of their life, yes.
Yeah, that's dignity also.
Yes.
And you speak about the ways of how to interfere, how much to interfere. Sometimes all the procedures, they might look very brutal for the strangers, not for the professionals. And also the solutions we take, decisions we take, might be very painful, long-lasting. It's like resuscitation after the myocardial infarction. You go up with simple resuscitation procedures. You can go to the artificial hearts, artificial organs, and it's about 3, 4, 5, 6 months of suffering. And what you are when you come out of those situations, who you become. And if you decide as a professional, so if sometimes you feel that you are doing probably not the right thing, then we should stop, then we should stop, or we are next to God.
Yeah.
You should answer those questions.
I do. I do, but it's another part of my work.
Yeah, very, very interesting.
I can't talk for hours, but that was just a part. So yes, that's the questions that you evoked are very, very important. What the accompanying of life and the brutality that appears to the relatives at the end of life. Is it important to have all the machines and all the tube, etc. And yes, because there is a visual impact of the end of life in resuscitation that is very hard for relatives.
And whom we are as a specialist.
Yes.
Doing things not knowing the results.
Thank
Thank you.
you very much for a very deep lecture.
Thank you.
Yes, I like your spatial analysis. And what's important, I agree totally with you that you are taking into consideration the possible potential future of the patient is very important because usually we are focusing on processes. We are thinking about what to do here and now, about present. And usually, sometimes we forget what will be with this patient if he gets back to life. And it's very important. And usually, it explains that we should not only focus on what we are doing, but also on how we are dealing with the patient and the situation. This is the way we can overcome the personalization. It's not just the object. We need to bring it back to life, to resuscitate, to just pump some fluids and so on. It's just a person who have to get back to his social life, social context and so on, and what are further consequences. And understanding the context is very important. And now I just remembered while you were talking, I remembered as a recent discussion with one head of a school. And I liked his attitude. And he says to teachers, he says, you should deal with pupils. While dealing with pupils, you should think about what do you want them to be when they be adults. And so this singular activity, this singular action is projected towards revealing potential of humanity. And such lectures like yours, they help to explain why should we care. Because sometimes we cannot explain to ourselves. Sometimes we get into processes and so on. And me and my colleague, we've been working on assuring of dignity to terminal ill patients. And we found an interesting fact that sometimes when organizational matters, when presence of a caregiver, when they go into they are prioritized, then usually we may face dignity violations. And so this is like, from Prof. Levinas, we could say that, you should personalize yourself in order to raise the personality of the patient or student or other person. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
What is this terminal illness?
What? Sorry?
No, he said terminal ill. So terminal illness. What is this?
It's end of life.
Personalized, yes.
Thank you.
Comments?
Maybe we should.
And I think from an ethical point of view, now about patient autonomy, and then patient is unconscious, so he can't take decision. But I think also it's important and it's controversial. How to know what patients really need at that moment, or it's maybe a patient just want to finish his suffer.
Yes.
Yeah. And
For this question, you must work with the relatives, because
yes,
you can ask them, what do you think your parent, your daughter, your sister could have wanted for herself? But when the patient is unconsciousness, it's impossible to know. And with in the other side, working in this kind of service with this level of technical things, so much machines, so much substances that are very specialized. When you look the other kind of unit in hospital, it's very, there are a lot of techniques. So I think the both sides are important. You can focus on one side or the other, but I wanted to show that the technique is important in the humanization of care, and not only in French we say non-technique, the aspect of non-technical care.
That's a simple one. It's not very difficult to translate.
Okay. There are non-technical care, yeah, like relationship. The question of the logbook is a non-technical care. But the technical care is inside the world care of the person. Because there are analyses that shows that the technical aspect could be a part of something that brings something of the deshumanization, the techniques. But I don't think so. I think techniques is inside the care and is important for caring the person. I wanted just to clarify that.
So this is the paradox: the more techniques, the more technology, the more possibilities.
But because at the beginning of the interview, G, the nurse that I was speaking about, told me that he wanted to work in an ICU because he was interested in the technical aspect. He wanted to learn something technical, more technical than he was doing in another unit. And then when he becomes a nurse in this unit, he discovered that the technical care is not only a technical care. I mean, that the example of the medicine, of the substance, is a good example, I think, because it means that this is something very, very technical. And at the same time, because you think about the future of the patient, it changes the technical gesture in a human gesture.
The more you have technologies in your hands, more possibilities, the more you depersonalize the patient. Then the question about the family members, whether they are really those who you should talk to before you take a decision. That's a eternal issue.
Yes.
The question whether you should talk daughter, son, their opinions might be different.
Yes, of
Often
course.
it is the case.
Like there is a point with the transplantation,
Yes.
to give the organs. Yes, that's a point too, because when the patient can talk, even if he's dead, you have to address the family and ask them, what do you think the patient could have wanted for himself? And when the person never expressed about these things, I mean, when the situation come over without any, like in an accident or I don't know, the family never thought about does my sister, my brother, my father would have want to give his organs. This is a topic too. I mean, this is an issue too. When you have to address the family, it's very hard to know at what point their speech talks for the patient or for themselves, for example. Because for the end of life, especially, it's very difficult. We can imagine for ourselves, it's very difficult to separate what I would like for my father and what my father would like for himself. It's a natural issue.
I would like to ask one more question. Practice, is it common in your country or logbooks?
It's not in all the units. I must think it's one example of practice, of daily practice. But I know there are articles about using the logbooks in the units, and a few units are using this tool, but it's not a practice. It's not obligatoire. Pardon, mais obligatoire. Obligatory.
Necessary.
It's necessary, but it is not.
It's not an obligation.
It's not an obligation. Okay, thank you. And the management of flights, this is the same. It's in this unit in particular. It's not in every unit. I don't know here how you work with the lights, with the sound, because for the sounds, that's an exception. I know that. Usually there are alarms in all units, but this one, there are a few nurses that wanted to work on this question of preventing the sources of discomfort, and so they worked on the question of the sounds and the clinical monitoring.
So I would like to say something about the issue of technique. Yes, because technology and technique.
Yes.
So there is this idea that it's coming frequently, and that was mentioned actually, that there is something which is impersonal.
Yes.
Yes, but on the other hand, and this is also what Hector said. Yes, so there's all these possibilities and so I think that in Levinas' perspective, if I'm not, you will tell me if I'm correct or not, but in the Levinasian perspective, there is something you have to separate the technique and the use of the technique.
Yes.
As soon as you use the apparatus and all these tubes and all these wires, yes, so this is something which actually is terrifying. Yes, you are terrified when you see this. And this is very impersonal. But once you start to use it, so then it takes another meaning. And which, I mean, of course, it will depend how you use it, I guess, but it can really overcome, I mean, become personal in the sense that it takes an ethical meaning.
Yes.
And this is, yeah, and so it's not.
It's not the tools.
It's not only a tool. It becomes something that you, and I mean, there is this idea that I think it's, you tell me if I'm correct or not, somewhere in, maybe in Gagarin and Heidegger, Gagarin and us, yes.
Yes,
So
about
the
the
idea
technique.
that because of the technique, we can feed people.
Of course.
And
The problem is not the tool.
so the problem is not, yeah.
The problem is not the tool, and the problem is not the technique.
Yes.
The problem is what is my perspective when I use a tool. That's the point of my presentation. I mean, if my perspective, if what I'm looking for is just using the tool, like G when he says he wanted just to learn something new, learn how to manage the machines, etc. Then he was focused on the tool itself, on the tool only, and not on the person he was using the tool for. And then when he thinks about the future of the patient, any tool he uses in this context can't have something neutral, because he uses it on the behalf of the patient. In this perspective, that is ethical perspective.
Yes, but can't you say more than that in fact, in the possibility that you have in the technique, there is a possibility, yes? Actually, independently of whether you use it or not concretely, or whether you want, that not goes to the consciousness of the one person who is taking care, yes, of the patient, but the very fact that there is this possibility
that it
so
exists
gives to the technique its ethical meaning, even independently of of how it is used. This is what I want. Yeah. So and I think that there are several places in Levinas where he's talking about science, about techniques, yes, and he goes against all this trend, yes, that was especially in France,
yes,
against technique and against science, and
in the issue of care, there is in France a school of thought that says it's different, the technical care and in France they call it cure with the French accent. It's not the word cure in English, but it's the same word, but the people give it a meaning, a new meaning. So a lot of people write on the fact that there is a separation between cure and care, but I'm not. I don't agree with this separation, because when you care for someone, you're using the technique, you're using tools for this person, and so the tools, as special as they can be, they are becoming, sorry, a way for the relationship they're becoming a way for the relationship and not just for giving life to someone. That's why I was comparing the preparation, the creation of a space and the creation of this book of history to, I was comparing it to the expectation of a birth. Because about the birth, we could not think this is neutral, all this about the welcoming some newborn. We are not, we can't think it's writing a story, the story of the family, etc. It could be something neutral. So it's not. It's the same in the kind of care in the using of the logbook. It's not neutral. It's not something the nurse have to do. So they do it every day and without any invest, personal invest. So the point is. Another point that I didn't evoke is how can the nurses manage their own invest in the work of in the usual work, in their everyday practice? How can they protect themselves in this everyday practice that is so close to the intimacy of the people? It's another issue I'm working on.
There are questions on the chat.
No, I think this is an interesting topic, but it's when you are saying this is very important. It is very difficult to remain professional and a doctor when you get involved so much with your patient that almost intimacy, you cannot be attached. And then you can think professionally, rationally, and logically. This, I think it can be discussed.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Peut-être qu'on peut.
Maybe you can close and then.